Chapter 14. The Holy Grail. Why do you want my friendship? There isn't a point in a life like mine. Sarah patrolled the empty streets of London with Bridget. It was early in the morning, where the only people they would see at night would be bobbies patrolling the streets or driving around in their ugly cars, or the occasional disgusting mistress of the night or conman dealing with illegal deals. Such worthless creatures, they aren't worth saving. Bridget was quiet tonight, a nice change of pace as Sarah was getting rather annoyed with her constant talking and yappering. In many ways she reminded Sarah of the new girl playing in the little sandbox, trying to make friends with everyone, and everyone returned the felicity, however they all secretly hated her. In this case, she knew why people hated Bridget. She was an ass to everyone she encountered. Well, there was no helping it. She was stuck with her until the task was done. She was here for some time, and she knew that it was only a matter of time before someone might catch hold of their ruse, but she couldn't leave without completing the task of stealing the Grail. Damn Brits. But she needed an opportunity to get down to the archive's basement, and it wasn't like an opportunity would just reveal itself. She had to make one, but how? She turned her attention back to Bridget. Bridget snarled, baring her teeth as she walked. "You seem quiet tonight. Why? Do you feel uneasy?" Sarah asked, trying to seem sympathetic, but she didn't honestly care. Bridget let out a sigh as she gazed at the bare moon, with a few stars to accompany the black sky, filled with nothing but the void inside her heart. The perpetual black stain of the world, caused by someone's careless opening of the Pandora's box, perpetuated the foul stench of humanity and demonology. Nothing sits right in the world. "I'm jaded, I suppose. I'm exhausted, much like everyone else, and much like you. I feel like a blanket with too few stitches. There are holes in it, and it easily comes apart. Every caster you see feels the same way, and those that strive to get away with it by breaking through the code are immediately put down. We put them down, you see, for the fabric of the world would come undone if all this information we held made it to the rest of the world. There was one time where it all came close." McCurdy knew her history quite well, had to for her job, and to be as efficient as she was in many aspects of her job, there were certain problematic incidents in world history which, if required, the caster's administration took no issue with escalating to ensure the proper people were killed. Even if that was to say a certain artifact was to find themselves in the hands of these dreadful normies, bastardly creatures, they had no one to blame but themselves for their worthless, meaningless existence. This world, she continued to think, was worthless, and all the souls in it. Would it be a horrid thing, really, to contemplate killing God? After all, if he was dead, could his heart break any more? No. Perhaps, maybe, just maybe, to prevent everyone's heart from breaking another time, to kill any and all things would be necessary. The world might thank someone for the undertaking, however, there'd be no world left. Is it worth it? McCurdy found herself wondering. The world she knew was abundantly different from the one her classmates from elementary school knew. She began to wonder if unravelling the fabrics of creation would ultimately be a better solution than continuing on a living death. In doing so, God's heart would truly be broken. "I don't know if I think it's worth it or not. I think so, or maybe that's just the lie I keep telling myself. Makes it easier," Bridget replied. "But I'd be lying. I don't think it is, but I keep doing it. I keep obeying these orders for the hopes of preserving creation. Sometimes I think it's better just to let it burn. Hell, maybe we should light the match ourselves." McCurdy opened her eyes. She didn't think anyone would openly say that, but even she believed it. "Ah, that's just me talking. Pay it no mind." "We were never told any of this at the American branch," she lied. "Because you are all fools," Bridget replied, looking back into the distance. "Americans don't spend time learning everything that's important, where you come from. You're all hypocrites." "I'd say that's hardly fair and misguided. Maybe I'm wrong, or perhaps you're wrong. Be that as it may, we can never accept—" McCurdy felt the wind abruptly change direction. She felt chills as the temperature around her dropped, her hair standing on ends. She felt the mana in the air being pulled on a singular focal point in front of them. The wind churned again from another direction, spiralling up with heavy winds. McCurdy felt like she was in the eye of the storm. McCurdy turned around swiftly, jumped off to the sidewalk, jumping away from the spinning vortex. Bridget stood by, glaring at the centre of the vortex. The wind whistled in the air that the moisture in the air turned into razor-sharp ice blades. Bridget glared dispassionately as her hand reached out. Her blue mana veins glowed throughout her body, channeling the mana from the air into her hand, materializing a broadsword. The blue veins crawled from her arm, encapsulating the blade she held in the air. A flash of lightning ripped through the ground, and then a clap of thunder roared. In the ground was now a hole. A chasm opened with freezing wind pushing up from it, pulling Sarah's hair away from her face. She pulled her hat down as she gazed into the abyss. She took a deep breath and pulled all the cold mana from the air into her mana veins. Her body was glowing blue, like Bridgette's, and she held her hand to the left of her, and her spear manifested into her hand. A second flash of lightning struck the ground they stood upon, followed by another clap of thunder. This lightning was blacker than the hole that seemed to be completely empty inside and with no end in sight. The rocks of the crust of the earth swirled around in the large vortex, making the hole larger with every passing moment. Sarah investigated the hole and then back at Bridgette, who still seemed dispassionate. A third strike of lightning rained down on them, and lightning seemed to be emitting from the hole in the ground, as if the bottom of said hole was now producing vast amounts of lightning. She took a deep breath as there was a loud hissing noise coming in from the hole. She looked down and she saw a vast mass of shimmering, scaly light at the end of the tunnel. She looked closely, and it was a large mass of snakes, curled up in a large sphere, rolling down the tunnel as if gravity was working on the other side of it. The hissing continued. "Get away from the hole!" Bridgette called out. The sphere picked up momentum, vibrating inside the hole, releasing various rocks and debris from the crust of the earth. Sarah jumped away from the hole, pointing her spear at the epicenter. Bridgette was muttering something underneath her breath. Sarah pulled the mana into her eyes, observing the mana streams Bridgette was casting. The streams of mana, brown, grey, silver, blue, green, wove together like a basket, marking many runes into the air. The sphere of snakes crossed the threshold of the portal into Pandora, hissing. Sarah pushed her fear behind her as it came rolling towards her. She firmly planted her spear in the ground, her mana veins turning silver as they started wrapping around her spear. The sphere rolled onto the spear, and she thrust upwards as her mana veins turned silver, pulling the mana from the poor quality of the essence from the minerals in the earth. It wasn't ideal to be using concrete for that, but it was something. The hissing became like that of a bell tower, and numerous streams of yellow mana from Bridgette's mana source shot out like a beam into the sphere, ripping apart several snakes, casting them aside as they withered like dying plants. "Don't look into their eyes! That is a Medusa! Don't look into their eyes! The Greeks got that myth right, although only partially. Their gaze will turn you into dust." Bridgette pointed her sword at her. Another creature came out of the hole that Sarah could see out of the corner of her eye, and the creature was a black form with the body of an abnormally large man and a horse's head. The beast, whatever this one was called, was the size of a small house, and certainly very agile. Bridgette struck its arm, and it clinked. Her blue mana veins penetrated her sword and struck through the arm, slicing it off, and the beast squealed as its blood sprayed. Another source of black lightning struck the earth over into the next block. Sarah pushed off from the sphere, ducking behind a street sign. Medusa, the great humanoid snake-like creature, completely manifested from slithering serpents, threw a small serpent at Sarah, who stabbed it with her spear. She noticed at the corner of her eye another creature coming out of the hole. She couldn't tell what this one looked like. "Sarah, get back to the administration and wake everyone up. We have a portal storm on our hands." "What about you?" "I'll be fine, but this is beyond anything you and I can handle by ourselves," Bridgette asserted. "I can hold the three of them for a time. I can't handle any more than that. I don't know how useful you are yet, but two casters can't handle a portal storm." Sarah nodded before slicing at the Medusa with her spear, ripping through its flesh, spraying its green blood on the ground. She inhaled the mana from the air through her mana veins, and her entire body was covered in them. With a jump, she landed onto the roof of a building and started running across the buildings, thinking to herself, "This is strangely convenient." Bridgette looked to the blue streams of light moving across the sky. She dropped a stone on the ground and jumped away from the horse beast. The humanoid creature with flesh decayed, and the side of its mouth was exposed. She saw a large hand with a claw ripping up the concrete, making obnoxiously loud noises as the various rocks and stones struck nearby buildings. Why such a heavily populated area? And why here of all places? There is no way they can keep this hidden. We're going to have to kill a lot of people tonight. The other creature flew above her. She penetrated the sword with her blue mana veins as she jumped up, cleaving its left wing. Red blood sprayed as the wing came off. The creature crashed into the building behind her, collapsing the roof and killed the people inside. Her heart filled with dismay as Medusa came over to her, and especially since she started to see lights get turned on. A lot of people are going to die tonight. Medusa tossed a snake at her. She closed her eyes, moving away, and she felt a pinch in her arm. Sarah pushed the door open into the administration building. There were few people inside the initial threshold into the office, minus the receptionist. There were some others enjoying a cup of tea who immediately turned their heads with alarm as the door swung open violently, nearly pulled off its hinges. The receptionist immediately stood up and glared at her. "Portal storm! We have a portal storm!" She pointed her spear outside. The receptionist's eyes gaped open and immediately picked up the phone. She pressed a button and dialed a number. As her phone rang, she opened her drawer. "Administrator," she said, "we have a portal storm." "Yes, understood." The people in the office immediately gulped down their tea, leaving the cups on the tables in the lounge area of the vestibule, and turned, walking to Sarah. "American, where?" the man asked. He was stern, tall, and menacing, well, to anyone else, but not Sarah. He had scars on his face. "Corner of Sandford and Edward Street," she immediately answered. "Bridget was there." Click. The lights in the room turned red, and a machine in the corner started emitting silent waves of mana, completely undetectable to the normal human, who at this point in history would still see magic as nothing more than a fairy tale. There was too much mana interference to communicate through normal means right now, especially during a portal storm. The man took the others in the room and ran out the door, sprinting in the direction of Sandford and Edward Street, London. She could hear the rattling coming from behind the corridors of the administration building. Administrator Sander came running out, with about 15 other casters behind him, their mana veins already breathing the air. Blue lights flashed as they sprinted down the halls. Sander stopped to look into her eyes as a man who had seen far too many battles. His shoulders were broad, and his eyes angled down his nose as he looked into her. "McCurdy, did you report this in?" "Yes, Administrator," she replied, looking intently into his eyes. "It's at the corner of Sandford and Edward Street." "Well, one of the portals anyhow. With me. We need to get down to it." He immediately turned to the receptionist. "Melissa, call in help from Cambridge. We need to put a stifle on this immediately. Operation Black Light." "Lead the way, Caster," shouted one of the irritable women in the back, wiping sleep from her eyes, hair tied behind her with bangs hanging on either side of her face. McCurdy nodded her head and sprinted out the door. The administrator and the casters followed behind her. Blue mana veins lit up the streets as they sprinted through them, over buildings and across alleys, keeping eye on the blue shining lights and the lightning portal storm looming not far ahead of them. McCurdy thought to herself, a lot of innocent people are going to die tonight, by accident or demon food. However, more people are going to be killed by the administration itself for witnessing such a thing, while the rest of the casters halt time to clean up the mess. She grimaced at the thought as she led them closer to the portal storm. It is sickening. There must be a better way than to kill those we are made to protect. There must be a better way. Be that as it may, the Casters Administration building is now empty, guarded only by a mere receptionist. Casters from Cambridge are sure to come by, and trying to clean up the mess is going to be damn near impossible to do overnight. This is far too convenient for my liking. Colton, did you plan this? Bridget was nowhere to be found amidst all the shining lights of blue, green, red, and blinding white. There were a handful of casters about, and an innumerous amount of these creatures pouring through the cracks of the earth. All the lights were on in all the buildings, and some sirens poured out with ambulances, bobbies, and fire trucks, which didn't last long without being torn to shreds. Sarah saw the carnage. Flames roared, buildings collapsed, bodies crushed and bled out into the sewers. Children and babies cried as their parents ran with them in their arms without a moment to think about what they saw. Their flight response moved them away from collapsing buildings and exploding cars and flying debris. To her horror, but not to her surprise, there was an archer. His blonde hair was filled with dirt, and his eyes were focused. One might think he was a trained killer had it not been the tears and hesitation in his eyes. He followed protocol as only he could, the one archer on the field, taking his mana-infused arrows, shining through running men, women, and their children. He sprinted off the buildings he used for his vantage point. One after another, he killed these innocent people. The arrows pierced his targets every time, never missing his shot, and the corpses of the dead bubbled as their life force faded into burning ash. But she noticed it wasn't just this archer killing normies. There were a few more archers patrolling the streets of London, with the sole purpose of killing normies, while Sander and the rest of the casters were dealing with these portals and house-sized threckets. Their life force was then imbibed by surrounding casters approaching the scene, using the mana to slay these demons and creatures coming up from these portals from the other side. The casters she was with went on without her, jumping from the streets to the buildings, summoning their weapons, chains, spears, lances, swords and axes to their hands as they moved down on the portals. Another class of caster came out, the true casters, which were few and far between, and exceptionally dangerous. They took their mana-infused knives and drew runes up the sides of the portals, screaming incantations. They left her by herself. This is too convenient, or the UK branch is very stupid. She drank the mana from the air, and the bright blue veins crawled up her legs as she sprinted back towards the administration building. She looked behind her, saw flares of red, white, green, blue and black lights. The demons roared, buildings and cars exploded, and more people died. Most of whom, she was sure, just got the short end of the stick, as most of them were not killed by these demons, but of that cursed archer. All those casters were far too occupied to be dealing with her, and she knew it, and she was sceptical, because this was all too convenient. She arrived at the building. She sprinted through the doors. The receptionist looked at her with a surprised look. The receptionist's eyes opened, reaching for a button underneath the counter. Sarah grimaced as she threw her spear into the receptionist's head. She fell silent, dead, her body going as still as a limp fish as she was impaled against the wall behind her. The blade sawed its way through her skull and collapsed to the ground. The blood leaked out of her skull onto the floor. Sarah yanked the spear from the wall with her hand. She pulled in mana from the air, weaving it with mana from the wood in the table and the glass from the mugs, and her veins protruded from her flesh, crawling onto her spear as it faded away. She ran down the hall towards the Library of Archives. She broke right in without ease and ran down the stairs. She ran down several flights of stairs until she came to a large square room filled with various artefacts, but she came here for one thing only, and she found herself looking at it, the Holy Grail, fused with the purple welding to the box of Pandora. The Grail, it was this beautiful object, golden, with silver lettering in the old Anglo-Saxon language, a language that was dead, but there was just something so beautiful about it. The silver writing appeared to glow, as they were carved by the holy hand of King Arthur Pendragon himself, or that is how the old stories were truly told. King Arthur, how shamed would he be if he saw the state of the world today, or even the wretched treachery of his beloved caster administration. But the box, Pandora's box, the cursed wretched thing, was so infused to the Holy Grail that it was beyond separation. She cautiously walked over to the Grail to touch it, but a searing pain filled her wrist. She hissed, retracting her hand as she moved to the side, observing the runes implanted in the ceiling above the Holy Grail. Should have known. She placed her hand out at the ceiling. Her fingertips were spread as she imbibed the mana from the air. She then took another drink of mana, pulling it from the steel and concrete of the floors and foundations. Her arm was covered in concentrated mana of red, violet, and magenta colours swirling around her arms. Coloured runes swirled around her body, pulling mana from the room from various sources into her body. Her eyes glowed red, fueled with complete passion, complete hatred, as the mana veins penetrated her pupils. Gain Seglian Leasing! The light emitting from the ceiling faded, and the contents of the Holy Grail was revealed. The liquid inside should have at one point been golden, but as it was infused with the box of Pandora, the content was filled with purple smoke, filled with nothing but curses. The same force that created this cruel world and all its malformities. She took her hand and grabbed the Holy Grail and the box of Pandora and sprinted upstairs. She ran through the archives and out the main hallway. To her surprise, pleasantly, no one was here. They should have dealt with the portal storm in its entirety by now. She scoffed as she sprinted to her quarters. She immediately grabbed her bag and put the Grail inside it. She strapped it to herself before facing the wall. She drank the mana from the air, the bars, the floor, and the foundation, as the mana veins flowed through her body again. She approached the back wall and placed her hands on it. The veins glowed black this time, as her entire body was covered in black mana, and she phased through the wall. 3 hours later, Bridget was leaning against a building, her sword dematerialised now that all of the Threckets were slain and portals were closed. She breathed heavily, covering her left eye with her hands. The rest of the administration was searching the now abandoned buildings for surviving normies. If anyone was found and might be savable, they were killed immediately. All part of the damn dreaded code. "Still alive?" She heard a voice from above her. He jumped down from the rooftop. "Unfortunately," she answered. "Did anything happen to McCurdy?" "I did a brief roll call, and everyone is accounted for, except her," he said. "I went back to the office, and I'm just coming back now. Melissa is dead, and it turns out someone went into the archives and the Holy Grail is missing." "You think she did it, don't you?" Bridget asked. "Everyone else is accounted for. The Threckets wouldn't dare look for it there," he replied. Bridget stared at him like that was the dumbest thing she'd heard. What would she even want with it? What would who want with it would be the better question, Sanders replied. This was all too convenient. Someone was behind the portal storms, and that someone in all likelihood knew what McCurdy was here. Bridget gasped, gazing over some rubble. Some rocks moved and a little hand stretched out, attached to a little boy. The boy cried, "Help me! Mama! Mama! Papa!" He kept weeping. Bridget knew the boy's legs were crushed underneath the weight of all that rock, and a weight filled her chest because this was all too familiar. She knew what needed to happen next. Sanders placed his hand over the boy's head. Magenta mana veins covered his hand as the boy lay dead. A quiet death and a simple one. Bridget looked at the boy. A mop-covered head, dirty face, and a face that the worst of mothers would love. She knew he was dead and knew that the way Sanders killed him was painless and that was a mercy. But why is this even necessary? She started weeping, sliding down to the ground, burying her face in her hands. "Sanders, there has to be another way." "Do you think all I do is send you out to fight those Threckets and erase evidence? No, I'm researching for a better way. The problem is, I have a theory, and I'm ultimately disappointed. I end up in dead ends of things that have already been tried." He sat down next to her. "I've run out of ideas. Everything's been tried already."